I want to tell you something your logical mind is going to want to push back on, something that the first time you hear it is going to feel almost impossible to accept. Because if it's true, it means that everything you went through, everything that confused you, hurt you, and slowly eroded your sense of what was even real in that connection, wasn't proof that they didn't care. It was proof of the opposite. The worse an avoidant treated you, the more they actually loved you. I'm going to say that again, slower this time, because I need it to actually land instead of just passing through. The withdrawal that showed up right when things started feeling most real. The coldness that dropped in the moment. The warmth between you had become undeniable. The pulling away, the sudden nitpicking, the distance that appeared out of nowhere like weather with no warning, all of it, every painful piece of it, was directly tied to how deeply the avoidant felt for you. Not inversely tied, directly. The more you meant to them, the worse it got. And the worse it got, the more you meant to them. I've spent more than 20 years sitting with this exact paradox. I've watched it play out relationship after relationship, causing the same kind of damage to the person on the receiving end, and the same confused, mostly unconscious repetition in the avoidant person doing the damage. And today, I want to walk you all the way inside the psychology of it, because I think you've been carrying around a story about what happened to you that's actively hurting you. And replacing that story with the truth might be one of the most healing things you do for yourself. Before I can explain how this actually works, I need to lay down something foundational about how avoidant attachment functions in the body, not just the mind. Most explanations treat avoidant behavior like it's purely psychological, a set of learned habits, a way of thinking, a pattern of interpreting relationships, and it is all of that. But it's also something much more physical and immediate than people give it credit for. It's a nervous system response. And once you understand it at that level, everything about how you read the avoidance directed at you starts to change. The avoidant nervous system learned very early on, in the most formative years of development, to link closeness with danger. Not through any conscious decision, nobody chooses this, but through repeated experiences of reaching for connection and running into something that felt threatening, rejection, being smothered, a caregiver who just wasn't emotionally available. That specific kind of pain that shows up when a child needs real attunement and the adult in front of them simply can't give it. The nervous system is basically a prediction machine. It takes what happens to you and turns it into an expectation for what will happen next. And what the avoidant nervous system learned to predict, with the certainty of something rehearsed thousands of times, is that closeness leads to pain. That real connection, genuine attachment, loving someone and feeling that love grow towards something full, that this is reliably followed by devastation. So the nervous system does exactly what it's built to do. It protects the person from the devastation it's predicting by firing off every defense it has the second that predicted trigger shows up. And the trigger is love. The defense is cruelty, not intentional cruelty, not the kind chosen with any awareness of the damage it causes. Cruelty in the mechanical sense, the way an alarm system does exactly what it was built to do the second it detects what it was trained to detect, with no override switch because it was never given one. I want to walk you through exactly how this unfolds inside an avoidant person as the love between you deepens, because I think seeing the sequence laid out clearly will let you look back at your own experience and finally understand what it actually meant. In the early stages, when the connection is still shallow enough for the avoidant nervous system to file it under manageable, when the warmth is real but the stakes still feel small, the avoidant is often at their most open, most charming, most genuinely present. This is the stretch of time people remember with the most aching clarity afterward, the period before everything shifted. And that period matters because it proves the connection was real, that the person you fell for actually existed, that what you experienced in those early weeks wasn't some fantasy you built in your own head. It wasn't. I want to say that plainly. The early warmth was real. The person you met in those unguarded first days was the actual person, the one underneath all the defenses, the one those defenses exist to protect. That version of them shows up freely when the depth of the connection hasn't yet crossed the line that sets off the alarm, but that line exists. And as the connection deepens, as your place in their life becomes more significant, as what's growing between you starts to reach past the surface into the parts of them they guard most carefully, that line gets closer, and then it gets crossed, and everything changes. Here's what crossing that line actually feels like from inside the avoidant experience, because this is the part almost nobody explains with any real precision, and without it, everything that happens next just looks cruel and senseless. When an avoidant's love for you crosses that threshold, what they feel isn't some recognizable version of love deepening. It doesn't feel like warmth expanding or attachment growing or that beautiful, vulnerable feeling of letting yourself fall for someone. That's what it would feel like for someone securely attached. That's not what an avoidant nervous system allows. What they feel instead, at the exact moment their love for you crosses that line, is danger. Physical, urgent, full-body danger. The same activation your nervous system produces in the face of a genuine threat, heart rate spiking, the sense of walls closing in, an overwhelming non-negotiable pull to create distance right now. None of it arrives labeled fear of loving you. It just arrives as a biological command to get away from whatever's setting it off. And the thing setting it off is you, not because of anything you did, because of how much you matter. Everything that follows, the withdrawal, the sudden coldness, the picking apart of small things, the confusing shift from warm yesterday to unreachable today, is the nervous system's emergency response to that command. It's not a decision. It's not a reflection of how the avoidant actually feels about you underneath it. It's the body's defense mechanism doing the only thing it knows how to do when love it has predicted will end in devastation gets too loud to manage. Now I want to get specific about the different shapes this takes, because the worst of this behavior doesn't always look the same, and naming its specific forms should help you recognize what actually happened in your own relationship, instead of continuing to run it through a framework that made you internalize it as something wrong with you. The first shape it takes is emotional unavailability that arrives without any warning. One day the avoidant is fully present, genuinely warm, present in a way that makes the whole connection feel completely mutual and completely real. The next day there's a wall standing where all that presence used to be, not a slow cooling, a switch flipping. And the more you reach toward the warmth from yesterday, the harder that wall becomes to get through. What changed between yesterday and today wasn't how the avoidant felt about you. What changed is that yesterday's warmth got processed overnight as evidence that the threshold was being approached, that the connection was real enough, deep enough, that losing it would hurt in exactly the specific, devastating way the nervous system has spent decades learning to avoid. So the wall showed up before the hurt could. The second shape is the manufacturing of conflict out of nowhere. An avoidant who loves you deeply will, at certain points, start finding fault with you in ways that feel wildly out of proportion, that seem to come from nowhere, that leave you feeling like you failed some test you didn't even know you were taking. Small things suddenly become huge. Things that were never issues before turn into issues overnight. Something the avoidant used to seem to genuinely appreciate about you suddenly, without explanation, becomes a source of friction. This is the avoidant nervous system doing something genuinely remarkable in how dysfunctional it is. It's actively scanning you for disqualifying evidence, looking for proof that you're not as extraordinary as you actually are, that the connection isn't as significant as it feels, that the depth of love is somehow containable because the person on the other end is flawed enough to justify containing it. If the avoidant can find something wrong with you, something big enough to anchor the idea that this loss wouldn't actually be devastating, the threshold suddenly becomes a lot easier to manage. And I won't pretend the cruelty of that is lost on me. I'm describing a mechanism where the person who loves you the most intensely is, at the exact same time, the most driven to tear you down. Not to hurt you, even though it does, but to protect themselves from the terrifying reality of how much you actually mean to them. The third shape is the withdrawal of the exact thing that made the connection feel most real in the first place. The avoidant who loved you with a specific, focused kind of attention, who noticed things about you nobody else ever noticed, who made you feel truly seen in a way you might never have experienced before, will, as the love pushes past that threshold, pull back exactly that quality. The seeing goes behind glass. The attention becomes managed, careful, measured. The warmth that used to feel like full sunlight shifts into something more distant and guarded, and you feel that specific absence acutely, and you reach for it. And that reaching registers in the avoidant nervous system as even more closeness, which reads as even more threat, so the withdrawal deepens further. And you're left wondering what you did to lose the thing that felt most real. And the honest answer, the one nobody gave you at the time, the one you deserve to actually hear, is that you didn't lose it because of anything you did. You lost it because loving you had become too real to sustain at the intensity it had reached. There's a fourth shape worth naming too, because it's subtler than the other three and it tends to slip past people entirely. It's the sudden appearance of an exit ramp, a reason, seemingly from nowhere, why this relationship might not be the right one after all. Maybe it's timing, maybe it's a mismatch in values that never seemed to matter before. Maybe it's a vague sense that something's off, described in language too foggy to argue with. This is the nervous system building itself an escape hatch in advance, laying the groundwork for a retreat before the retreat is even necessary, just in case the pressure keeps building. It's not dishonesty in the way we usually think about it. It's closer to a parachute being packed by someone who doesn't yet know they're about to need one. And if you've ever found yourself defending the relationship against an argument that didn't even feel like it belonged to the person making it, this is very likely what you were up against. I want to pause here and speak directly to something I know is happening as you take all this in, because I've just handed you a framework that explains the avoidance cruelty as an expression of love, and I'm aware that framework carries a real risk, the risk that you'll use it to excuse behavior that was never excusable, that you'll take this understanding and turn it into a reason to absorb even more damage in the name of a love that only ever expressed itself through hurt. I am not offering you this as an excuse. I need that to be completely clear. Understanding why something happened is not the same thing as accepting that it should have happened. The nervous system's defensive response doesn't create any obligation on your part to keep being the target of those defenses indefinitely. Love underneath cruelty doesn't make the cruelty harmless. And the psychological explanation for why someone treated you badly doesn't erase your right to decide you're no longer willing to accept being treated badly. What I'm giving you instead is this, the truth of what was actually happening, so the story you tell yourself about it, the story shaping how you see yourself in the context of love, intimacy, and your own worth as a partner, can finally be accurate instead of damaging. Because the inaccurate version, the one most people construct without this understanding, sounds something like this. They treated me worse as things got deeper. So as things got deeper, I became less desirable to them. So the more someone actually knows me, the less they'll want me. So my depth is a liability. My realness is the problem. And the truer version of me that comes out in real intimacy is the version that pushes people away. That story is a lie, and I want you to hear me say that with everything I have. It's a lie built out of a real experience. The hurt was real, the worsening treatment was real, but the meaning attached to that experience is completely, demonstrably false. The truth is the exact opposite. The more they knew you, the more they loved you. The more they loved you, the more threatened they became. The more threatened they became, the worse they behaved. Not because you became too much with proximity, because you were too seen, too genuinely extraordinary for a nervous system that had been trained to treat love as a countdown to disaster. Now let's talk about what all this means for the bigger question, whether an avoidant person can actually change, because that's where this conversation needs to go, and it's where most people need honesty far more than they need comfort. The pattern I've described, the worse they treat you, the more they love you, isn't some fixed, permanent trait baked into who an avoidant is as a human being. It's a feature of an unhealed nervous system operating without the intervention of real therapeutic work or sustained, honest self-reflection. It's a learned pattern, and learned patterns can be unlearned. A nervous system trained to link love with threat can be retrained through the right kind of consistent experience and the right kind of internal work to link love with something else entirely, with safety, with the possibility of real, sustained intimacy that doesn't end in devastation. But that retraining isn't simple, it isn't fast. And it definitely doesn't happen just because the avoidant loves you enough to want it to happen. Wanting to change and actually having the capacity to do the work of changing are two completely different things, and doing that work, the sustained, often painful process of rewiring a nervous system response that's been running since early childhood, requires a level of self-examination and a tolerance for vulnerability that avoidant defense mechanisms are specifically built to block. I also want to name something that tends to get lost in conversations like this, because it's easy to hear all of this and walk away thinking the only two options are to stay and absorb the pattern indefinitely, or leave and give up on the person entirely. There's a third possibility, and it's the one that actually respects both the truth of the mechanism and your own well-being at the same time. It's the option of loving someone from a place of clear eyes rather than blind hope. That means being able to see the pattern for exactly what it is, without either excusing it or being destroyed by it. It means being willing to set a boundary that says, I understand where this comes from, and I still won't stay inside it while it's actively harming me. Sometimes that boundary is the very thing that finally creates enough consequence for the avoidant to start their own work, and sometimes it isn't, and the relationship ends anyway. But either way, that boundary is not a betrayal of your understanding of them. It's actually the most respectful thing you can offer both of you, because it refuses to ask either person to keep living inside a dynamic that was quietly destroying you both in different ways. Here's what that means practically for you, and I want to say it with both compassion and complete honesty. An avoidant who treated you worse the more they loved you is absolutely capable of becoming someone who can love without that pattern running the show. That capacity is real. I've watched it happen. I've worked with avoidants who did the work, who faced the wound instead of running from it, who built the ability to stay present through the activation instead of fleeing it, who learned how to cross that threshold without triggering the old defense. That transformation is possible, but it only happens if they want the change more than they want the protection. And for most avoidant people, getting to that point takes time, real loss, and enough accumulated consequence that it finally reaches past the defenses and touches the part of them that already knows what this pattern has cost them. I also want to say something about timing, because it matters more than people realize. The moment an avoidant is most likely to actually begin that work is almost never the moment you're standing right in front of them, patiently waiting. It's usually much later, often after the relationship has already ended, when the absence of you creates a kind of silence loud enough for them to finally hear what their own patterns have been costing them. This is part of why so many avoidants seem to wake up only once someone has already walked away, Not because losing you taught them to love correctly, but because your presence, while it was still available to reach for, gave the nervous system exactly the safety valve it needed to keep avoiding the deeper reckoning. As long as reaching for you was still an option, the system had no reason to change. It's a hard thing to accept because it means the very thing you were hoping would inspire their growth, your steady presence, may have actually been what allowed the pattern to keep running undisturbed. So here's what I want you to understand about where you stand in relation to all of this. You are not responsible for making it happen. You cannot make it happen through your patience, your love, your generous interpretations of their behavior, or your willingness to absorb the worst of it, hoping it will eventually burn itself out and reveal the love underneath. I've watched people try. I've watched extraordinarily patient, extraordinarily loving, extraordinarily self-aware people give years of their life holding space for an avoidance eventual breakthrough. And case after case, what I've actually witnessed isn't the breakthrough arriving because of that patient holding. What I've witnessed is the person doing the holding becoming gradually and then suddenly too depleted to keep going. That work belongs to the avoidant. It starts when they decide it starts. It cannot be willed into existence by someone else's love, no matter how deep or how sustained that love is. So what can you actually do? The only thing genuinely within your power is to be honest with yourself about what you're willing to accept right now, while that work isn't yet happening. Not what you hope for down the line, not the potential you can see buried in them, not the person you know exists underneath the defenses, the one who occasionally, magnificently, surfaces into the space between you. I mean the present. The actual, current, lived experience of being connected to someone whose nervous system is still running this pattern in real time. If that present isn't acceptable to you, if the worsening treatment that shows up right alongside deepening love is costing you your sense of self, your trust in your own perceptions, your basic belief in your own worth, then your answer is already clear. And a clear answer deserves to be acted on, even when acting on it is the hardest thing you've ever had to do. There's one more thing I want you to carry forward, because I think it changes how you relate to your own future. Understanding this pattern doesn't just rewrite the story of what happened to you. It also changes what you're able to recognize the next time it starts to happen again, whether with the same person or someone new. Once you know what the sudden coldness actually is, once you know what the manufactured conflict is actually protecting, once you know that withdrawal at the exact moment of deepening intimacy is a signature rather than a coincidence, you stop being confused by it in real time. You stop spending months trying to figure out what you did wrong. You start seeing the mechanism clearly, almost as it's happening, and that clarity is its own form of protection. It doesn't mean you stop feeling the hurt when it shows up. It means the hurt no longer comes bundled with the added injury of self-doubt, of wondering whether you imagined the whole thing, of quietly deciding you must be too much simply because someone else's nervous system couldn't hold what you were offering. I want to close with what I think is the single most important thing I can leave you with today. The worst of what you experienced was never about you, not about your worth, your desirability, your value as a partner or a person, someone genuinely capable of being loved deeply and sustainably. It was about a nervous system reacting to the specific, extraordinary, genuinely destabilizing fact of how much you mattered. You mattered enough to trigger the most powerful defenses that person had. You mattered enough that the love they felt for you crossed the exact line their entire psychological architecture had been built to protect against. You mattered enough that a nervous system running on decades of learned prediction flagged what existed between you as the single most dangerous thing it had ever had to try to hold. That's not a small thing. Sit with that for a second before you move on. You weren't treated worse because you mattered less. You were treated worse because you mattered more than their unhealed nervous system knew how to hold on to. The love was real. The The fear was real, and the cruelty was just fear wearing the only clothes that nervous system knew how to dress it in. You carried the weight of all three, trying to love someone through a storm they couldn't explain and couldn't stop. You deserve to carry something different now. Not the story that your depth is a liability, but the story that your depth is the most remarkable thing about you. Not the story that what happened was some verdict on your worth, but the truth that it was a confession of someone else's limitations. And the gap between those two stories is the gap between a life spent shrinking yourself and a life spent finding and becoming someone finally completely capable of holding the full size of what you carry. You were always that size. You were always worth being loved by someone who knows how to stay. And that love, the kind that isn't afraid of its own depth, that doesn't treat closeness like a countdown to disaster, that can actually receive what you offer without bolting from what it means, that love exists. It's out there looking for someone exactly like you. And having survived this, having understood it clearly, having refused to let it shrink the truth of who you are finally completely ready to receive it.